I want to talk a little bit about what economists call social choice. How to determine what the optimal or the right amount of, let's say, environmental protection, of managing an environmental resource, reducing climate change, reducing global warming. How do economists get at an answer to this normative question of what is the optimal, what is the right amount? So to illustrate some of the concepts that economists use to think about how society should make decisions over different bundles of consumption, right? How to use their resources in an optimal way. Let's consider two consumption bundles, and these bundles can include, natural and environmental resources. It can include man-made capital and resources. And so the question is, which bundle should society prefer? And let's just explore different mechanisms, different social choice mechanisms that could kind of inform us of what an appropriate answer would be. Right, the first mechanism or criterion that we'll consider is what's called the Pareto criterion. All right. The Pareto criterion says, suppose we're starting at consumption bundle B1. This is the state of the world that we're at. And if we're going to use the Pareto criterion to determine whether we should move, right, from B1 to B2, to make this switch, Pareto criterion said that this move is desirable if no one, right, in the population is made worse off, and at least one person is strictly better off. And so you can kind of think this is a win-win situation, right? Pareto criterion or Pareto improvements, what we call Pareto improvement, is a move in society, from one state of the world to another, where nobody's worse off and at least somebody's strictly better off. Okay, we can use a figure here to kind of illustrate the idea of a Pareto improvement, where we have two people. We'll call this person Anna. This is Anna's kind of utility, starting from 0, and we'll call this person Brewster. And on the vertical axis, this is his utility, and starting from 0, so obviously they're, moving in the positive direction. And this is what you call that utility possibilities frontier. And given our finite resources in society, that there could be all kinds of different states of the world, consumption bundles, different B1s, B2s, BNs, but they would either be on the frontier itself or inside, this curve. So anything on this outside, given the current state of the world, current technology, current resources, current understanding, we can't achieve. So let's say we're at state W for whatever reason. We're inside the utility possibilities curve. We're consuming at consumption bundle W, and Anna is enjoying what we'll call A sub W, and Brewster is enjoying what we call B sub W. And we could consider moving from point W to point, X, Y, and Z, and then we could, call this point up here U, and this point is not possible at this point. This point is not possible at this point. Right? Not possible given resource constraints. Given resource constraints. Okay? And we're looking at a world between status quo W and X, Y, and Z. And so if we're considering a move to X, well, Brewster is definitely better off from that move. But you can see that Anna, if we track her utility from X, is definitely or clearly worse off. And so a movement from W to X would not pass the Pareto criterion. If you think about it, does not pass the Pareto criterion. And if we think of a movement from W to Z, this is not going to pass either, because you can see that Anna is much better off. Anna's living large from consumption bundle Z, but Brewster is moving down from BW to BZ, which would be down here. And Y is going to be the only, right? This is a yes, it passes the Pareto criterion, is that society, by the Pareto criterion, would prefer to move from W to Y, and the reason is that both Anna and Brewster have an increase in their utility under Y relative to W. Okay? This is what we call a Pareto improvement. Consumption bundle Y is a Pareto improvement relative to W. I drew this lens here, this 90-degree, what we call lens, and I'm shading it because this lens illustrates the entire map or possibilities for Pareto improvements given a starting point or the starting state of the world of W. So the Pareto criterion has a way to decide whether to move from one state of the world, the kind of the status quo, to another through like a new policy or policy shift is pretty limiting, right? This is really what we call win-win situations, or at least nobody's losing, at least somebody's winning, and this can be pretty constraining. You can imagine that there's a policy shift where there are tremendous gains by a large fraction of the population, and only one or two people are minorly hurt by such a shift, that it may be advantageous to do that, but it wouldn't pass the Pareto criterion. Which leads to the next variant social choice mechanism, which is kind of a variant of the Pareto criterion, what we could call a Pareto, let's call it a Pareto improvement. You gotta spell improvement right. That's part of it. It's part of the action with side, do I have the width in there? Yes, side payments. Right? This idea that if somebody is hurt, if somebody's worse off from moving from one state of the world to another, or from implementing one policy shift relative to the status quo, that if side payments could be made such that nobody is worse off after the payment, and at least somebody's better off, then society should make that move. Right? It's the idea of the Pareto criterion, but recognizing that maybe the losers have to be compensated by those winners, and still it's the case that at least somebody is strictly better off. So let's think about what that, pop some numbers on here. Let's just say that this is 5 and 5, right? So 5 utils, some measure of utility. It doesn't matter, it's going to be the relative comparisons that matter. And let's consider a shift here. Okay, we'll call this S. I've got no real rhyme or reason to my letter choices, but these are 5s. And so if we're going to use this idea of let's go from W to S by the Pareto criterion, we know that this fails because you can see that Brewster is going to be worse off and is better off, but it wouldn't pass the Pareto criterion. But suppose that this gives Anna this move at a state of the world S, consumption bundle S, she's getting 10, okay? And then suppose at consumption bundle S, Brewster's getting 3. A movement of, again, W to S, Brewster loses 2, right? 2 utils, 2 something, and Anna gains 5. And so we know that the net gain, right, the winners minus what the winners win and take out what the losers lose is 3. And so this would be by a potential Pareto improvement with side payments, that this would be welfare enhancing and this would pass. Now how would this work? Well, Anna would have to compensate, right? Anna compensates Brewster by, paying or whatever to, right, if we can monetize these things. And Brewster is then indifferent between points W and S, so hasn't lost, right, back to that kind of Pareto idea. And Anna is up 3. Again, we could, monetize these values, but it's the relative points that matter. And so such a move, right, would pass. As a Pareto improvement with side payments, we often call that a potential Pareto improvement. The potential is that it's there, but it requires some reallocation of resources. All right, moving on, kind of from Pareto to potential Pareto, we get to economists Kaldor and Hicks. The Kaldor-Hicks compensation we could call it, it's often called the principle or criterion. Principle, criterion, can kind of use those interchangeably. Might make sense to think about criterion because of the Pareto. And what did Kaldor and Hicks say? Well, it's essentially codifying this Pareto improvement, but saying that side payments, as long as they could be made, they don't have to be made to make this socially desirable, to make this a desirable shift from kind of the status quo to some other state of the world. So the Kaldor-Hicks compensation principle, if transfers or side payments could be made so that nobody's worse off, and at least somebody's better off, then this is a desirable move, right? And this is important because it's not that side payments are required. This is the fundamental idea behind cost-benefit analysis, right? It's Kaldor-Hicks compensation principle, is that even if there are losers, it may be socially desirable. The point is that the winners must win more than the losers lose. Is that this is the underlying idea behind benefit cost analysis, right? The idea of that if it passed the benefit cost analysis, it must mean that the net benefits are positive, benefits minus cost. And if that's the case, then it must be true that the losers lose less than the winners win. It's probably obvious that there are infinite number of mechanisms, social choice mechanisms that society could use to decide what we should do, whether this is worth doing. And serious equity concerns, or generational concerns, ethical concerns, morality concerns. There are infinite number of ways to make societal choices. I'm kind of focusing on the ones that economists think about, or the ones that drive economic research like cost-benefit analysis. Another one that we're very familiar with, this will be the last one, and I'll kind of go over an example utilizing all these, is voting. Right? Voting is a somewhat what we think of as a democratic, but a social choice mechanism. Often, if a vote gets majority, then something passes. That doesn't mean that everyone wins. It doesn't necessarily mean it passes the Pareto criterion. It doesn't even necessarily mean it passes the cost-benefit analysis. You could have kind of a minority of losers that lose tremendously, and a majority of winners that win marginally. And so thinking about how voting works is important because we use voting practically in a very in a lot of dimensions on how we decide how to move society. Of course, elections is a big one, but we vote on all kinds of things, both locally and nationally and internationally. Right? In many international environmental agreements, we have voting rules. And so you got to think, when we think about voting rules, I mentioned that it may not pass, the cost-benefit analysis or the Kaldor-Hicks compensation, but it depends, right? If we're using majority vote, or sometimes a super majority, or you can think of other things that if it's unanimous, if you require everyone to say yes, then this is very similar to a Pareto criterion. Right? If everyone has to say yes, then they're at least indifferent, or you could think they're at least indifferent personally from the current state of the world to whatever they're voting in, or they're better off. And so a unanimous vote is kind of this kind of way to operationalize a Pareto improvement of Pareto criterion. A majority is not the case, or supermajority is not the case, right? And I'll pop up here majority. And as mentioned, the results of a majority vote may not pass, what economists focus in on kind of a cost-benefit analysis to determine what is a good idea or what is a desirable move. But nevertheless, voting is important, right? Its simplicity, its democratic nature make it so we rely on it for social choice quite a bit. I want to go over a very simple, maybe silly example where we can look at these 4 social choice mechanisms and movements from one state of the world or a status quo to another and see what they have to say about that move. And we'll start with a small island called Eco Island. And on that island is an active volcano. Here's what's going on, right? It's like erupting. And we'll call this thing Mount Econ. And on this small island, Eco Island, we have 3 residents. We have Timmy. We have Sandy. And we have Benny. They live there, right? Now, Benny, he lives right here. He lives pretty close to the action. I mean, who knows? Who knows why he built that house? Maybe it was in the family. We're not gonna get to the bottom of that question. But Timmy and Sandy live separately. Down by kind of this southwest corner of the island. Still in harm's way. I mean, Eco Island is small. Now, let's consider that there's a technology that can prevent any damages from this erupting or active volcano. And it looks like this. Looks like a spoon. And basically it just covers this thing up. And that technology could prevent any damages from Benny, Timmy, or Sandy. And the cost of this technology is a whopping $21,000. It would prevent all damages. Now, each of our residents has a willingness to pay to avoid the damages, which, if you think about what is the willingness to pay to avoid damages, well, that's the value of those damages, right? That at least want to avoid, if they could avoid it for free, they would. The willingness to pay is kind of the maximum monetary value they'd be willing to pay to avoid suffering these damages. And we don't have to talk about how we know these values at the moment, because our interest is in social choice mechanisms. But they differ, and they differ in the obvious way. Since Benny is suffering more of the damages, his willingness to pay is, well, more than triple Timmy and Sandy's. There are 2 plans. Ooh. Squeaky. 2 plans, maybe the yellow's less squeaky, is A, tax each resident $7,000. Right? Of course, if 3 are taxed $7,000 and they're required to pay that to cover the cost of the what do we want to call this? Something sophisticated like a spoon? Anyway, that could get us there. Blue is the least squeaky. We're sticking with this one. Another policy, I changed my mind. Benny pays $21,000. I mean, we're not saying this is a fair policy, we're just saying this is an option. So plan A, let's think about this in terms of the Pareto criterion. Would plan A pass the Pareto criterion? And the answer would be no, right? I'll erase that in a minute, but in terms of plan A, it wouldn't pass the Pareto criterion, and the reason is that Sandy and Timmy are worse off, although Benny is strictly better off. Could it pass a Pareto improvement with side payments or a potential Pareto improvement? And the answer is yes. We know that the willingness to pay in total, right, is the 15 plus the 8, the 23,000, which exceeds the 21,000. And so there's a net benefit to society, the 23,000 minus the 21,000, for purchasing and implementing this technology. We know that's the case. And so you got to think about how this can work. Benny, better off by 8,000. He could pay both Timmy and Sandy, right, and compensate them for their losses. If they have to pay 7,000, they save 4, but they're still out 3. So he pays Timmy 3, he pays Sandy 3, and remember, he was up 8, and so now 8 minus 6, he's still up 2. And so Benny compensates Timmy and Sandy, paying each 3,000, and Benny is still up 2,000. And we know that that's going to be the case because of the 23 minus the 21. So yes, it passes this with side payments, right? If actual payments are being made and nobody is worse off, Benny is better off. And it passes Kaldor-Hicks, which is less constraining because it says side payments don't need to be made. It's just if they could be made. It's the same thing. It's just that this is saying this is a socially desirable move, even if we have losers, as long as the losers lose less than the winners win, and Benny wins more. And then we can think about voting. Well, we know if this was unanimous voting, if unanimous, then the answer is no. If majority, the answer is no, because both Timmy and Sandy would vote no on a tax of 7,000. Voting, by any normal voting standard, would come to a no, but it would pass a cost-benefit analysis. And so, at least in the economic eyes, in terms of efficiency of maximizing net benefits, voting does not always get you there. Policy B, Plan B. Now, Benny pays 21,000. Benny is not happy, okay? This is not going to pass Pareto criterion because Benny's worse off. Would it pass Pareto improvement with side payments? The answer is yes, right? Right? We know that Benny's willing to pay 15,000, and if he had to pay 6,000 more, then to make the 21,000, he's worse off. So he'd need to be compensated that 6. But we know that Timmy and Sandy would earn enough, right? They're getting the 4,000, they're paying nothing, that they could each kick in 3,000 and compensate Benny for the loss. So we know that this could work, right? And these two are always going to be side by side, right? We're not going to have differences between the two. It's just how they're operationalized. And then voting, well, if it's unanimous, then the answer is no, right? If it's unanimous. But the answer is yes if it's majority. Okay? And so you can see that, yeah, a majority vote on something that's, clearly not fair or equitable, or at least equitable, could pass. And in that case, it corresponds with what would be considered a cost-benefit analysis decision-making of Kaldor-Hicks and a potential Pareto improvement.